Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Shravani, Assistant Professor, St. Francis College for Women, Hyderabad. In this paper on comparative literature, dramas in India, and the course that we are talking about now is Women's Theatre, Theory and Plays. This module that we are looking into comprises Nathabati Ananthabat by Shaoli Mitro, an audio play, and Brides Are Not for Burning by Deena Mehta. Now, when we look at this module comprising this audio play and this full-length 2-act play, it is imperative for us to understand the context, the socio-cultural context from which these two texts surface. Now, if you are used to or you are familiar to the context that India was in 1980s and 1990s, you will know of this infamous incident of Sati Roop Kanwar, the immolation case, which happened in 1987. Now, this incident, this unspeakable horror, triggered 3 types of writing. The first was the sort of research on feminist issues and women's issues in contemporary India. The second sort of text was the plays and other fictional works on such feminist issues. For example, Brides Are Not for Burning by Deena Mehta. And the third sort of text that surfaced as a result of this was Shaoli Mitro's Nathabati Ananthabat and others of its type, where there is an reinterpretation of Mahabharata and Ramayana from a feminist perspective. Now, before we look at Nathabati Ananthabat by Shaoli Mitro, we will start with it. Let's look at who is Shaoli Mitro. Now, Shaoli Mitro is the daughter of famous Bengali thespians and group theatre personalities Shambhu and Tripti Mitro. Following her rich theatrical heritage, she got into the stage career at the age of 4 in a play called Dosho Chakro, which was a production of her parents' theatre group called Bohurupi. But owing to long spells of health issues, around 1978, she chooses not to appear on stage anymore. During this period, she goes into experimenting about audio plays, translating Eugene Ionesco, and also looking into different ways of experimenting with audio plays. Now, in 1982, she comes in touch with the famous book, the epoch-making book of Iravati Karve's called Yuganta. Now, Yuganta is a reinterpretation of Mahabharata from different perspectives. It's a retelling of sorts. Now, Shambhu Mitro, when he introduced this book to Shaoli Mitro, also suggested that she might come up with a play based on this book, and Shaoli Mitro did. So, she looked into the story of Draupadi and saw how this empress, this princess, this mythical character was as much a woman as the thousands of us across culture over all throughout the history. She has been manipulated, she has been used, she has been humiliated, she has been downtrodden. Her entire humanity has been negated in the hands of society and men. Now, before we start looking at the text and the narrative of Nathabati Ananthabat, let's look at the setting of it. Shaoli Mitro very interestingly puts this entire play into the ancient Indian tradition of Kathakatha. Now, if you are familiar with the Indian tradition of Kathakatha, you will know that in ancient Indian theatre, there has been an instrument of the storyteller, the Sutradhara, the narrator, the Kathak, a man who narrates the stories from Hindu scriptural texts accompanied by music, singing, choric characters and other sorts of accompaniments. Now, what Shaoli Mitro does is extremely interesting. Shaoli Mitro changes this entire male-centric narration into a female perspectival narration where the storyteller is a woman, Kathak Thakurun, the madam storyteller, who is of course Shaoli Mitro herself. Now, this Kathak Thakurun, in an extremely prolific way of narration, slips between past and present, between perspectives, between one sort of narration to another sort of narration, all the time empathizing with multiple characters from Mahabharata. It is not that because it's Draupadi's story that the entire way of the entire perspective focuses on Draupadi alone. Now, if you look at the image of Kathak Thakurun, you will see how Shaoli Mitro does not dress in a very traditional Bengali, the linguistic community that she came from, Bengali woman. She dresses in a different way, which is in a way cross-cultural. She pleats her sari differently. She wears Orissa style nose rings. She wears different sort of silver jewelry, and she speaks with gestures which posits her as a cross-cultural Indian woman who is speaking of another woman and her predicament. Now, if you are familiar with the Pandavani tradition of Chhattisgarh, you will know of Tijanbai. Now, Pandavani tradition, very similar to Kathakatha, actually it's another offshoot of Kathakatha, is actually from the state of Chhattisgarh, where people speak about, narrate the story of Pandavas, as the name suggests, and the story of Mahabharata. Now, there are two sub-traditions in this Pandavani tradition. The first is the Vedamati tradition, which is less popular. The other is the Kapalik tradition, which is followed by Tijanbai, which is more vibrant in a way. She dances, she sings, she occupies the entire stage, and she is accompanied by her chorus characters who help her to portray the situations, the episodes from Mahabharata most prolifically. Now, coming back to Nathabati Ananthabat, the narration of it, Shaoli Mitro starts Nathabati Ananthabat in a very interestingly rustic Bengali accent, where she first introduces herself and she welcomes the audience, and she also introduces her topic of the day, that is the story of Draupadi. Draupadi the empress, Draupadi the princess, Draupadi the wronged wife. Now, Nathabati Ananthabat is roughly translated as the orphaned wife, or as Nobunita Debsen translates it as 5 lots, yet none the protector. Now, Draupadi is with 5 husbands, yet she is protected by none of them. She starts the narration from Draupadi's Swayamvara, where she falls in love with Arjuna and she deliberately chooses to lead a life of poverty and deprivation as Arjuna's wife, who she mistakes to be a poor Brahmin. And then she jumps, there is a narrative jump to the perspective of Kunti, where Kunti chooses to let her marry all of her 5 sons, because she realizes that all of her 5 sons are lusting after Draupadi, and if only one marries her, then the others might develop a sort of fraternal discord. She also suggests, Shaoli Mitro also suggests, that Kunti looks at Draupadi, she's touched by this helpless young innocent child, and for a second her heart melts. But she also recognizes that if Draupadi marries only one of her sons will never be united enough to get their kingdom back. It's a political alliance, and Draupadi is a political pawn. She's a political currency over here. So she washes her hand off this entire business and she asks Yudhishthira to make the decision, and Yudhishthira accepts this proposition. There is a narrative jump again, and it comes to the gambling episode, which Shaoli Mitro, Iravati Karve and everybody else kind of considers as the focal point around which the story of Mahabharata changes its course. Now, before getting into the gambling sequence, Shaoli Mitro also talks about where Draupadi is remembering this small harmless episode where in the Palace of Illusions, Yudhishthira objects where Duryodhana is humiliated. Now, Draupadi remembers it as a harmless episode where Draupadi laughed out at Duryodhana's lapse, but it in a way provokes Duryodhana to orchestrate the entire gambling scenario. In the gambling, Duryodhana, who is still angry about his humiliation in the Palace of Illusions, he provokes Shakuni, his uncle, to beggar the Pandavas and humiliate them in the worst way possible. And Yudhishthira, going against his honorific title, the Dharmaraj, does things which are not exactly following the Hindu scriptural code of conduct. He gambles, and he gambles away his land, his kingdom, his brothers, himself, and finally his wife. As Draupadi is dragged in the open court, by scantily dressed and menstruating, she screams for help. She also asks Yudhishthira that if Yudhishthira has already lost his freedom, how can he retain his ownership of Draupadi, and in that case, how can he actually bet Draupadi in the gambling? Now, Iravati Karve finds this episode a tactical mistake in Draupadi's part, because she says that in those days even a slave with no freedom could have ownership on their women folk. So even if Yudhishthira had lost his freedom, that doesn't stop him owning Draupadi. But Shaoli Mitro, thankfully, does not really follow this sort of argument, and she also commends Draupadi's way of going against the tide and trying to defend her honor. She also says how Karna's suggestive words disturbs her further. She has nowhere else to go, and Draupadi now can only scream for help, but nobody answers, as if the entire court has lost their tongue, lost their voice. Now, Shaoli Mitro also comments how Draupadi refuses to surrender her dignity and to fall and beg for mercy. She does not, she protests. And Draupadi also accuses everybody present of adharma. Now, Shaoli Mitro also says that probably the supernatural help from Krishna never comes. It was Dhritarashtra who stopped this entire sordid episode because he was very scared of public outrage. But Draupadi was saved by none, protected by none. It is also suggested that Bhima tried to punish Yudhishthira because of his compliance to this entire gambling scenario, but Arjuna stops him by mouthing empty words of honor and duty. This is not the end for Draupadi's humiliation. During their Agyatavasa, during their time of exile in disguise, she is harassed and molested by Kichaka, the general and brother-in-law of the king, to whom they were offering their service. Bhima is the only one who saves her by killing Kichaka most gruesomely. This enrages Draupadi more, and the end of this exile, she practically eggs her husbands for a dharma yuddha, a justice war. But when this justice war actually happens, it is not for her honor, it's the honor for the 5 Pandavas. And she loses everything, and she loses her sense when all of her 5 sons lose their life. They are brutally murdered, and unlawfully so. As the Pandavas prepare to leave in their last journey towards heaven, Draupadi drops first in suffering and misery. And when the other brothers ask Yudhishthira that why would an honorable and virtuous woman like Draupadi fall the first in this journey, Yudhishthira says because Draupadi always loved Arjuna more, though she was married to all of them and should have loved them equally. Draupadi, overhearing these words, realizes that whatever Yudhishthira has done was out of spite, and she forgives him and feels sorry. As she lies dying, she remembers the few moments of happiness that there was in her life, and she ultimately realizes that it was only Bhima who loved her selflessly. As she lies dying, Bhima drags himself and tries to comfort her last moments. Nathabati Ananthabat ends by saying how this misery for a woman is perpetual. It is always there. It's eternal over history, irrespective of the culture that the woman comes from. Can we stop? The second text now that we are looking at is Deena Mehta's Brides Are Not for Burning. As the name suggests, the play in 2 acts is on bride immolation. The story centers the demarcation and the marginalization of women in our society. The story concerns the death of a young woman called Lakshmi and how her brother and sister go around looking for justice, and they are refused justice in every quarters. Now let's have a look at who is Deena Mehta. Deena Mehta is an Indian Parsi playwright. She talks about the women issues that we were speaking about a little earlier in this module. Now, she has written several short stories along with several plays and a novel titled And Some Take a Lover. The novel centers on a proposed intercaste marriage, but Brides Are Not for Burning has been immensely popular. Her first full-length play, The Myth Makers, won the Sultan Padamsee playwriting competition, and Tiger Tiger, which was based on the life of Tipu Sultan, won wide critical acclaim. She often brings out the parochial narrow-mindedness in different metropolis, including Mumbai. Her play Getting Away with Murder deals with childhood trauma, sexual abuse, infidelity and insecure relationships in modern urban spaces. This is Deena Mehta. Now let's talk about the set design and the stage directions of the play. Now Deena Mehta makes different sets for the two-act plays. There will be one portion of the stage which will act as the Desai tenement room, which is poor, which is grimy and which is very grimly sparse. The second is Sanjay's very plush and opulent living room. The third is Tarala's kitchen. The fourth is Vinod's office. And the fifth is Lakshmi's in-laws living cum dining room, which is richly but garishly decorated. Now, of the two acts, and in the first act, the first two scenes will be happening in the Desai tenement room. The third scene will be staged in Sanjay's living room. In the second act, if you see, the first and the last scene will be in again the Desai tenement room, and the second, third and fourth scenes consecutively will be occurring in Vinod's office, Tarala's kitchen and the in-laws living cum dining room. Now, if we look at the stage direction, Deena Mehta is not exactly very particular about stage direction. She gives cues for laughter, for facial expressions, for gestures, but other than the last moment of denouement, there is no important stage direction as such in the play. Now, the story starts with Anil and Malini, a brother and a sister, and their almost senile father, Mr. Desai, who are talking about their elder sister Lakshmi's horrific accidental death. She has burned to death. And Malini and Anil are very disappointed that they did not get any justice from anybody. Lakshmi's death, Malini believes, is not accidental but a dowry death, because Lakshmi's old neighbor and friend Tarala had kind of hinted to Malini that Lakshmi's in-laws were present during her death but did not do anything. Roy, Malini's acquaintance, comes and sexually harasses her and also asks her to join him in his political revolution. In the second scene, Dr. Palkar, who is Anil's old professor, comes in to warn Anil about Malini, who he thinks is consorting with politically undesirable people. Accidentally, he also lets Anil know that he is acquainted with the doctor who attended Lakshmi in her deathbed, but incidentally, this doctor was only called 3.5 hours after Lakshmi's accident. So Anil goes in search of Malini's suitcases and boxes and finds political manifestos, which kind of disturbs him, and he resolves that he will be doing something about his elder sister's demise and also something about Malini's undesirable political connections. In the third scene, Malini comes to her boyfriend Sanjay's house, and she is propositioned by Sanjay, who assures her that he finds her attractive but will never find her good enough to marry. Malini submits to Sanjay out of disappointment and self-disgust. But incidentally, Malini also gets to know from Sanjay that Vinod, Lakshmi's husband, had reinstated Tarla's husband into his job so that he could exploit Tarla's witness in regarding Lakshmi's death. In the second act, Anil and Malini are trying to resolve this truth, this horrific truth about Lakshmi's death. And the news comes in that Dr. Palekar has been attacked by the politically undesirable revolutionaries and he has been killed. Anil is disturbed and he resolves to do something about Lakshmi's death. And Malini also resolves to go her own way to look into the truth of Lakshmi's death. In the second scene, Anil goes to confront Lakshmi's husband, Vinod, and accuses him of being complicit at Lakshmi's death in order to gain Lakshmi's life insurance money. Now, Vinod denies all these accusations vehemently, but he also tries to bribe Anil into silence. Anil leaves. In the third scene, now Malini goes to Tarla's house and tries to get the information about the truth about Lakshmi's death from Tarla. Tarla lets slip that Lakshmi was systematically harassed by her in-laws for dowry and for not having any children, and out of desperation she tried to immolate herself. Her in-laws did not stop her because they wanted her out of the way so that they could claim her life insurance money. Lakshmi's mother-in-law overhears it and threatens Tarla into silence. In the next scene, Malini goes to Lakshmi's in-law's place and bribes Vinod's brother Arjun and their servant Kallu into getting the information out, and the information that she gleans from them concurs with Tarla's account that Lakshmi had locked herself up in a room and tried to immolate herself, and even when they could break the door and attack and stop Lakshmi from hurting herself, they did not do so. In the final scene, Anil and Malini realize that they will never get justice from this system which has been corrupted from the very start, and they have been bribed into silence by Vinod's rich family. Roy comes to force Malini to come with him to assist him in his political agenda. Malini says that no political change will ever help the society unless the society changes from within. Roy and Malini face each other, and we see how Malini's shadow overpowers Roy's. Now, let's look at the important themes that this play comes up with. The first thing, of course, is the gender demarcation. Deena Mehta shows how every second women are being ostracized from the society. The society will never really speak anything about the women. Throughout the play, we see how Lakshmi first was manipulated by her family, because after her mother's death she had to leave her studies to take care of her family and her young brother and sister. And later she was married off to a rich family because her father wanted to preserve the family honor and fortune. Then it is also hinted how the father abandoned his first wife because she could not present him with children, and he had also maritally raped his second wife occasionally. Malini is sexually harassed by both Sanjay and Roy, and her brother, who is her staunchest ally, also tries to curb her political aspirations. Secondly is the theme of corruption. Anil and Malini never get justice for Lakshmi. They know it because the judiciary is corrupted and the judiciary is sold to the rich. The Vinod's family, they have successfully bribed the judiciary. Secondly, it is also mentioned how Sanjay's business is not entirely legal. It is also hinted that Tarla's husband was incompetent, but he was reinstated in his job so that Tarla's witness could be manipulated. Arjun and Vinod's servant Kallu is bribed into silence by Vinod's family as well. So in these two texts we see that women's predicament in our society, it has not changed over the centuries. Things have happened in the hovel and in the palace alike. All it is needed is for the society to recognize the evils, the social evils that there is, and to be aware of the ways to change it. So to look back in this entire module, what we have learned in this module is first that in the early 90s and the entire 80s, there has been an upspringing of feminist texts. And two of the texts that we looked into summarizes how some of the social evils like bride immolation, about sexual harassment, about the reassessment and reinterpretation of epics happened during these 20 years, and the tradition continues later. We looked into Shaoli Mitro's famous audio play Nathabati on Ananthabat, where Shaoli Mitro, as the madam storyteller, tells us the story of Draupadi, the empress, who has 5 lords but is protected by none. Later in Deena Mehta's 2-act play Brides Are Not for Burning, we look into the sad death of a young woman called Lakshmi and the disappointment of her siblings when they are looking for justice because the judiciary is entirely corrupted. Now, for further reference, you can look into the e-text that is available to you. There are also texts which you can refer for extra information in the Learn More sections, and there is another section for self-assessments with multiple choice questions and some essay type questions.